If you want to test a man, give him power. And men and women too don't do so well with it. We need limits on power. Forget about electing the perfect guy, the right guy. Set your rules to be the right rules, whether you've got the right guy in or the wrong guy.
And which brings us to the ultimate in power, slavery. It's worth mentioning that Andrew Jackson, we just mentioned a moment ago, and John Tyler, who we were discussing, both were pro-slavery men.
And pro-slavery in a way that maybe Thomas Jefferson, who owned slaves, and George Washington, who owned slaves, were not as pro-slavery. In other words, among the founders like Jefferson, Jefferson, to both his credit and to be negative with Jefferson, he's a big hypocrite, because in essence, he said things like all men are created equal, and he recognized the horror of slavery and yet still participated in it. And it was a different time. And of course, decades later, when we're talking about Jackson and Tyler, it was a little different time. But the nature of slavery and the wrongness of slavery, is a universal, or should be. At the same time, however you want to look at those folks, like when I was a kid, and learned history, Thomas Jefferson had red hair, I had red hair. He said a lot of great things. People didn't make a whole lot out about him being for slavery. He was kind of my hero. He was the founding father that I like best. And these days I lean more toward Patrick Henry, but of course he had slaves too. But it's the kind of thing where we have a very rosy picture. And then we get to more modern times, and I would say we have a pendulum swinging not back to the center and some sort of reasonableness, but a going way to some kind of craziness. For instance, there was an effort years ago in the New Jersey legislature to pass a mandate that they study the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And of course, anyone who opposed that bill because it's stupid for the legislature to be mandating all kinds of things for the schools to do, you've got my applause. But it was fought, and by the Black Caucus in the New Jersey legislature, because Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, was a slave owner. And it's, look, celebrating the Declaration of Independence and acknowledging Jefferson for writing it, you don't have to believe he was a great guy or even a good human being. And he may have been a good human being, even with all of his evils. And that's even, if you take him in today's time and he was that evil that he's, off owning slaves, what he said is still true. All men are created equal and are endowed by these inalienable rights. And as we talked about this summer, nobody's found new freedoms beyond what was talked about in the Declaration of Independence. So we have to have some sense of, how do we judge slavery in this country? Well, it was a terrible, horrible evil. How do we judge race relations? Well, there were all kinds of just horrors that happened throughout our history. And of course, they haven't all been whites against blacks. As we pointed out in one of our commentaries, the first case where the courts basically said someone could own somebody else for life was a black slave owner who went to court in Virginia and had the court ruled that he could own another black African for life. And it's not that there wasn't racism involved in all of this, there was, but the more people know about slavery, the more they, I think, will know that it's not exclusively about race. It's about power. It's about this sick idea that slavery is somehow okay. It's some people's fate to be slaves. It's not inherently a Western concept. It's been on the globe for a long time. It's horrible. And it's horrible that America participated in that. But this whole idea that slavery is the end all and be all, and especially as we got into in our scripts. And I urge people, we wrote 3 in a row on slavery, which is something we rarely do. We did it because it's an important issue. And it's just critical that people, what we're seeing now is people acting as if slavery was some intrinsic part of the free market, which of course you just can't say the words free market and slavery and pretend they go together. But more and more we're hearing that sort of thing, as if slavery were unique to America, as if it somehow couldn't be, was eradicated everywhere else, but somehow couldn't be eradicated here. That all whites owned all blacks. It's more complicated than that. And especially the idea that the solution to it is to give the government a lot of power and have a socialistic system. And it turns out that, of course, all kinds of early socialists were advocates of slavery. Marx has said all kinds of pro-slavery things. And that doesn't get talked about very much. But if you have the idea that maybe America became wealthy because of slavery, that capitalism became possible because of slavery, I really urge you, we write very short pieces, 250, maybe 300 words at max. Read the 3 pieces, go to the links, do some Googling, because the difference between the free market and socialism, or feudalism for that matter, is huge. And the idea that somehow the concept of slavery goes with the free market is insane. And thank goodness we eradicated it, even though we eradicated it in a war that killed 800,000 people. And it is, I think it is shameful that we went so long after that war without any sort of equal rights. And I mean, they were there on paper, they weren't there in reality. I have differed with some libertarians on the Civil Rights Act in 1964, because I think the racism that was ingrained in a lot of the South, there was racism in the North too, but it just wasn't ingrained in the same way. In Mississippi and Alabama, you had state agencies that connected and worked on separating the races and racism. And it wasn't just, kind of a kind separation. And so I think you had to do something to break the back of that sort of control. For instance, a business lunch counter that wanted to serve Black citizens in Mississippi, that the owner of it might have said, if I do that, I will make more money for a week, and then my family will be killed because they'll firebomb my house. There was a level of violence and that is just, that's not there in America today, thank goodness. But so, the point of all this isn't that slavery wasn't that big a deal. It's just a huge sin and crime throughout history and in this country as well. And it's not that there wasn't tremendous racism, and there's still racism. People aren't going to be perfect. And where there's institutional racism, we've got to change those institutions. But this new drive to look at everything by race, to make everything about race, and to suggest that we need a government powerful enough to decide who deserves exactly how much, who's had privilege, exactly how much privilege they've had, who hasn't had privilege, who's been discriminated against, where the intersectionality of it all is, and then some, social score like they have in communist China, or I shouldn't say communist, capitalist totalitarian China, whatever you want to call them. That is a recipe for disaster. We have a melting pot with all the disagreements this country has. This is the world's best melting pot. This is the place where racism, I'm convinced, is least, not most. And we need to continue to make progress on that. If we get into a everything's about race, it won't end well. It won't end well on the issue of racism. It won't end well on the issue of peace and freedom and stability. So I think it's great to learn the history of slavery, but learn it. And that's not about spin. That's not about, therefore, today we need this, and this. But I think the more people learn about the history, the more skeptical you are of government power, and the more confident you are, even though sometimes it's painfully slow, and I mean painfully slow, the more confident you are that people over time get better. People come up with ideas, people connect across religions and races and genders and so on. And so, there's every reason to be optimistic, and yet it seems like we have gone backwards. And so there's some reason to be pessimistic about where we are when it comes to race and government and that sort of melting pot that has always been a source of pride in this country, as painful and as ugly as the process has been.
On Friday, you mentioned Lawrence Ludlow's piece in The American Thinker, in which he talks about his experiences trying to teach again in a plush, mostly white school in Grosse Pointe. And he mentioned in one paragraph trying to explain to them the history of slavery. And the kids were incredulous. They didn't believe him when he mentioned that the word slave comes from the word Slav. And that's a really weird thing to see come into the conversation, is radically incorrect ideas about slavery.
Well, but the more your goal is for the students to think a certain way, the more you are going to tailor that education that way. And once you start tailoring and spinning, and look, I kind of do this for a living, at least in part, tailor things and spin and talk about and connect. And I feel like I do it honestly and wonderfully. People should send checks, cards, heartfelt, greetings. But it's hard not to, you don't want to get all your history from me. You don't want to look, and unfortunately you can't get your history from the schools because they have an agenda. I read the Washington Post just about every day. I'm on vacation, I'm not reading it, and I feel so good. Anyway, but I feel like I have to read through the spin on almost everything, that they want me to think. Sometimes they're so busy telling me how I should think about a story that I feel like they didn't give me the facts of the story. And I feel like that's the case with slavery. It's, they want, and come on, nobody's out there who thinks this is good. It's not like you have to spin this a whole lot, but it reaches a point at which it's being used as a lever and in the wrong direction.